The cold had stopped bothering Zarelia years ago. It was the silence she feared, the particular, weighted silence that always came just before Seraphina smiled. Not the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, not the kind that means warmth or welcome, the kind that means she has already decided what comes next, and she is simply enjoying the moment before it arrives. Zarelia knew that smile better than she knew her own reflection. She had learned it the hard way, the way you learn anything that is trying to survive you, slowly, painfully, by paying attention to every small thing. She stood at the dressing table now, brush in hand, working through the last section of Seraphina's dark auburn hair with steady fingers. Outside the tall windows of Ironhold Dravenmoor, the evening sky had gone deep violet. Candles burned low in their holders. What the room smelled of jasmine and warm wax. Beautiful. The way a trap is beautiful before it closes. Zarelia pulled the brush through the final braid, her wrist aching with the movement, and told herself what she had been telling herself for nearly 5 years. Keep your hand steady. Keep your face empty. Do not give her anything to use. The smile, reflected in the mirror, began to form. The evening gathering would begin in an hour. 40 nobles from across the northern territories would fill the grand hall of Ironhold Dravenmoor, and Seraphina Bloodmoon, Luna to Alpha King Draven Nightfang, the most powerful ruler in all the wolf kingdoms, would descend the staircase looking precisely the way she always looked, radiant, composed, and utterly untouchable. No one in that hall would look at her and see what Zarelia saw every day. But they would see the high cheekbones and the violet eyes, and the way she moved through a room like she owned the air inside it. They would see her take Draven's arm with a graceful hand, and they would admire the picture they made together. The dark-haired Alpha King with his storm-grey eyes, and the beautiful Luna at his side. Perfect, and powerful, and permanent. They would not see the small silver ring Seraphina had pressed into the inside of Zarelia's wrist 20 minutes ago, calmly, almost absently, the way you might pick up a cup and set it down again. The burn still stung beneath the sleeve Zarelia had pulled down the moment she heard footsteps in the corridor. She had not cried out. She hadn't flinched. She had simply pulled back her wrist and continued the braiding with the same careful hands. Yet because flinching gave Seraphina something, a reaction, a confirmation that the aim had landed, and Zarelia had stopped giving her those years ago. "Clumsy of you to get in the way," Seraphina had said, her voice as smooth as the jasmine oil in her hair. "Do try to be more careful around my things." As if Zarelia had been the one holding the ring, as if her skin had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong moment. Zarelia had said nothing. She had only pulled her sleeve down and reached for the next section of hair. That was survival in this room. Not courage, not defiance, just the daily, patient work of giving Seraphina as little as possible to build on. She studied the Luna's reflection now as she finished the braid, the violet eyes moving slowly over her own face in the mirror, satisfied with what they found there. Now Seraphina was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, the kind of beauty that stops conversation and turns heads and makes people trust what they shouldn't. In the 4 years and 7 months since Zarelia had been assigned to private service, she had never once seen that beauty turn inward into anything soft. She secured the braid with a pin and stepped back a precise distance. "The emerald earrings," Seraphina said, not moving her eyes from her own reflection. Zarelia moved to the jewelry box. There was a time, long ago, when Zarelia had not known how to be invisible. She had been 13 years old, and the daughter of proud shifters in a small village, at the edge of the Ashenwolf forest, which was where her surname had come from, or passed down through generations of wolves who had lived and hunted in those silver-barked trees. Her parents had been quiet people, steady, the kind of wolves who did not need to be the loudest in the room to be the most certain. She remembered her mother's white wolf form most clearly, the way it moved through moonlit clearings with an easy, unhurried grace, the way her father's brown wolf would press his great head against her mother's shoulder when they stood together at the forest's edge, watching the stars come out. She had been trying to learn her own shift that last night. 13 was late for a first shift. Most pups managed it at 11 or 12, but her wolf had always been quiet inside her, private, content to wait. Her mother had told her not to worry. Some wolves come in their own time, she had said, or the patient ones often run the farthest. She had been standing in the back field, concentrating, feeling the familiar pressure of her wolf pressing against the inside of her chest like something asking to be let out, when the howls started on the wrong side of the forest. Rogue wolves, a full pack of them, moving fast. Her father had shifted mid-stride before she had even processed what she was seeing. Her mother's white form had been beside him an instant later, both of them charging toward the tree line without a backward glance, because that was what wolves did. You ran toward the threat. You put your body between your children and the dark. Zarelia had tried to shift. She had felt her wolf surge, felt the transformation beginning to rise, and then her mother's howl had torn through the night. Not a battle howl, a final one. Everything inside Zarelia had gone perfectly, completely still. She had stood in the back field with the fire beginning to spread behind her, and she had waited for the shift to come. And it had not come, and it had not come, and the sounds from the forest had stopped, which was somehow worse than the sounds. She had survived because the rogues found her in the field and saw only a girl, a human girl, small and terrified, alone in a burning village. They hadn't bothered. She had been worth nothing to them. She spent 4 days wandering after that. She didn't eat. She didn't cry. She had gone somewhere past crying, into a numbness so complete it felt like a second skin. She had walked toward the distant outline of a great castle because it was the only landmark she could see, and she had no other direction to point herself. Althea Stonefang had found her at the forest's edge on the 4th morning, a weathered woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron and a basket of washing balanced on her hip. She had taken one look at Zarelia, the hollow eyes, the amber tint that marked her as a shifter, the way she held herself with the particular stillness of someone whose body had learned to expect more bad news. And she had asked no questions at all. She had simply said, "Come with me, love. I'll find you something warm to eat." And later, when Zarelia was sitting at a kitchen table with a bowl of broth in her hands, Althea had sat across from her and said quietly, "Your wolf is in there. I can tell. But if anyone else can tell, if they see that amber in your eyes and start asking questions, you'll stop being a girl to them and start being a problem. Broken shifters don't get mercy in this castle. They get used." Zarelia had looked at her across the table. "So stay quiet," Althea had said. "Stay small. Let them think you're nothing. And I'll keep you safe as long as I can." It was the most practical kindness anyone had ever shown her. She had been nobody's pity project and nobody's charity case. She had been a girl who needed a strategy, and Althea had given her one. 6 years in the castle kitchens. Invisible, efficient, forgettable, safe. And then one afternoon, in her 6th year, Alpha King Draven Nightfang had walked through the kitchens after returning from the northern border. Dust on his boots, exhaustion in the set of his jaw, storm-grey eyes sweeping the room with the automatic awareness of a man who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. For exactly 3 seconds, his gaze had crossed the room and found Zarelia's. There had been nothing extraordinary about the moment. No thunder, no recognition. Just a man's eyes pausing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Something unguarded moving through his expression, like a door opening briefly on a room no one was supposed to see inside. Then he had looked away and continued toward the corridor, and Zarelia had gone back to her work, and that had been that. She had not known that Seraphina was standing in the archway. She had not known that the Luna had been watching Draven for weeks, cataloguing every small, unconscious movement of his attention, logging every face his eyes had lingered on without his knowledge. She had not known any of it. Until the next morning, but when she was pulled from the kitchen and told she had been reassigned to the Luna's private service. That had been 4 years and 7 months ago. The emerald earrings caught the candlelight as Zarelia brought them to the dressing table. Seraphina lifted them from her palm without acknowledgement and fastened them herself, tilting her head to check the effect in the mirror. Then she turned in her chair and looked at Zarelia directly, something she did only occasionally, and always with the particular quality of attention that made Zarelia feel like an object being appraised. "You'll stay in tonight," Seraphina said. "Prepare my return chamber. The blue candles, not the white. I've told you this before." "Yes, my lady." "And Zarelia." Seraphina's voice dropped into something quieter and more deliberate. "If I find a single thing out of place when I return, we'll revisit the conversation we had about carelessness." She glanced, just once, toward Zarelia's wrist. Then she stood and smoothed her gown and walked toward the chamber door, and she was already someone else, entirely by the time her hand touched the handle, radiant, warm-eyed, the Luna that Ironhold Dravenmore adored. The door closed. Zarelia stood in the empty chamber for a moment, the smell of jasmine thick in the air around her. Then she reached up and pressed her hand flat against her own chest, where something small and strange had been happening for the past several weeks. A faint pulse, like a heartbeat behind a locked door. Her wolf, silent for 10 years, sealed away in the grief of a 13-year-old girl who had never quite finished breaking, pressing once, quietly, against the inside of her ribs. "Not now," she told it, the way she always did. She reached for the blue candles and began to prepare the room. She watched from the shadows of the upper corridor as Seraphina descended the grand staircase. Draven was waiting at the bottom. He offered his arm in the practiced gesture of a man whose relationship to his Luna had been built more on alliance than on warmth, the two of them performing the role of united rulers with the efficiency of people who had long since stopped needing to discuss it. His storm-grey eyes did not sweep the room. They never did when Seraphina was present. Zarelia had spent a long time not thinking about why she noticed that. She watched until they disappeared into the hall, then turned and went back to her work in the silent chamber. The burn on her wrist pulsed once in the cool air. From somewhere deep inside her chest, the wolf pressed again. Softer this time. Not urgent. Just present. "I know," she thought. "I know you're there." She pressed the feeling down and went to light the candles. Zarelia rose before dawn. Not because she was required to, though she was, but because the thin sleeping mat in her small room off the servants' corridor offered little real rest, and she had learned long ago that there was something almost bearable about the pre-dawn hours. The castle was quiet then. The stone corridors were empty, for a handful of minutes each morning, before the household woke and the day's particular pressure began. She could simply exist without performing the careful blankness her face had to wear in Seraphina's presence. She dressed by memory in the dark, plain grey uniform, sleeves to the wrist, collar to the throat. She had not always worn long sleeves in the summer months. That had changed. In the corridor outside her door, she found a small cloth-wrapped parcel tucked beneath the linen stack. She knew before she opened it what it would be. A healing salve in a small clay pot, faintly sweet-smelling, already mixed with the herbs that reduced inflammation. Althea. Moving through the castle before the sun rose, leaving small, impossible kindnesses in the only ways still available to her. Zarelia held the cloth for a moment. She looked down the empty corridor in the direction of the laundry rooms. She thought about the way Althea's face had looked the last time their eyes had met across a crowded hallway, the particular expression of someone who knows they cannot do enough and has learned to carry that knowledge quietly, the way you carry a stone you've decided not to put down. She tucked the salve into her pocket and went to prepare the Luna's vanity. The morning duties had their own architecture. Zarelia had mapped every detail of them in her first weeks and had never deviated since, because deviation created gaps, and gaps gave Seraphina material. The washing water had to be exactly the right temperature, warm enough to steam slightly, not warm enough to cloud. The vanity had to be arranged in a specific order, the small items on the left, the large on the right, and the silver-handled brushes laid out in sequence, from widest to narrowest. The fresh linens folded in the particular way that did not leave a visible crease along the top edge. None of these things had been written down anywhere. Zarelia had learned them through the only system Seraphina used for teaching, the consequence of getting them wrong. She moved through each task with the automatic attention of someone who has long since internalized a checklist she was never allowed to hold. Water temperature, vanity arrangement, linens, wardrobe sequence, morning tea. The wolf pressed against her sternum as she worked, quiet but present. Since the night of the gathering 2 days ago, it had not gone fully still again, and she was not sure how she felt about that. For 10 years, was its silence had been a kind of protection. If she could not feel it, she could not grieve it. Now it was like having a room in your house you thought was empty, only to find there was a fire burning in the hearth after all. She finished the linens and went to heat the water for tea. Seraphina returned from the gatherings after meetings in the mid-morning, and Zarelia read the mood the moment the chamber door opened. Not loud. Seraphina was never loud, but the particular stillness of her movements, the careful, deliberate way she set down her gloves, the way her eyes did not settle on any single thing in the room, signaled a composure that was working slightly harder than usual. One of the noble ladies had spoken with Draven near the eastern fireplace for a long stretch of last evening, as Zarelia had heard about it from the kitchen attendants, who heard everything. The lady in question, Callista Frostfang, visiting from the southern territories, was widely considered one of the most beautiful women in the northern kingdoms. Zarelia watched Seraphina's profile and understood without needing to be told. "The tea is cold," Seraphina said, without looking at the cup. Zarelia lifted it. It was not cold. She had prepared it less than 10 minutes ago. "I'll prepare a fresh pot, my lady." "Don't." Seraphina turned from the window and looked at her with the particular expression that had no temperature behind it. Not warm, not cold, just precise. "Sit." Zarelia sat in the plain chair near the door. She arranged her hands in her lap and kept her face empty, and waited for whatever shape this morning was going to take. "Your mother," Seraphina said, moving toward the vanity with unhurried steps, "was a wolf of some standing in her village, I understand. Before the fire." Zarelia did not respond to this. She had learned that the personal histories Seraphina occasionally referenced were never offered as connection. They were offered as entry points, places where a person's armor had a seam. "It must be remarkable," Seraphina continued, picking up a hairbrush and running her thumb along the bristles, "to have come from something real and to have become this." Her eyes found Zarelia in the mirror. Not a wolf, not quite human. Nothing in particular. "Is there something you need, my lady?" Seraphina set the brush down. "I need you to understand your position," she said, "which is that you serve in this castle at my preference. Not the king's, or not the steward's, mine. And when I find your performance inadequate in any area, the arrangement becomes less certain." She said it the way a person might remind someone of a bill coming due. No particular heat, no cruelty in the tone, just the plain geometry of it. "This is how things are arranged, and I am the one who arranged them." Zarelia looked at her hands in her lap. "Yes, my lady," she said. Seraphina turned from the mirror and went to her reading chair, and the conversation was over, and Zarelia went to remake the tea, and the morning continued. She did not allow herself to think about Cassian until she was alone. 3 years ago, Cassian Wolfsbane, a senior guard with a broad and a serious face and an honest manner that had always made Zarelia instinctively trust him more than she trusted most people, had caught her in the secondary corridor with fresh bruising on her neck, too high to conceal with her collar. He had stopped walking. He had looked at her with the careful attention of someone connecting pieces of information he had been half-assembling for months. Then he had said quietly, "This didn't happen in a doorframe." She had not answered. She had not had to. He had read the answer in the particular way she had gone, still, not with fear of him, but with the fearful knowledge of what his concern, however well meant, could set in motion. "Let me help," he had said. "Please don't," she had said back. He had gone to the castle steward anyway, quietly, privately. He had done it out of something honest and human in him that he could not fully override, even when she had asked him not to. She understood that. She did not blame him for it. Within a week, Cassian had been transferred to the northern ice border, a posting that broke men's health and spirit over a single winter. He had left without saying goodbye, which meant the transfer had been sudden. A servant girl named Liana, who had been kind to Zarelia in small ways for 2 years, had disappeared from the castle entirely that same week. No formal dismissal, no record, simply gone. No message had been delivered. None was needed. Speak, and others pay. Stay silent, and only you pay. Choose accordingly. Zarelia had chosen accordingly ever since. She pressed the salve from Althea's parcel gently against the burn on her wrist, to standing in the small storage room off the kitchen corridor, where no one came in the mid-afternoon. The herbs cooled the skin almost immediately. From inside her chest, the wolf pulsed again. Steady. Patient. "I know," she thought again. "I know you're still there." Later, in the early evening, she was polishing the bronze wall sconces in the upper residential corridor when she heard footsteps at the far end, a particular rhythm, unhurried and certain, that she had learned to recognize the way you recognize sounds that matter for your safety. She pressed closer to the wall and focused on the sconce. Draven Nightfang walked through the corridor at his usual unhurried pace, his attention divided between a folded letter in his hand and the middle distance of someone carrying multiple calculations in his head simultaneously. Or he was in traveling clothes. He must have just returned from a short border inspection. And there was a quality to his movements that morning, something slightly different from his usual contained focus. He did not look at her, but 2/3 of the way down the corridor, his pace slowed. Not dramatically. Not consciously, perhaps. Just a fraction. a step taken slightly less quickly than the one before it. The scent of rain-soaked earth and something warmer beneath it drifted faintly through the corridor, and she told herself afterward that she had imagined the way his head had tilted, just barely, in the direction the scent had come from. Then he continued, rounding the far corner and disappearing from view, and Zarelia went back to the sconce with her cloth, and the corridor was empty again. She pressed her free hand flat against her chest. Her wolf was not pulsing anymore. It was very, very still, the way a creature goes still when something important has happened and it is paying full attention. "Stop," she told it, with considerably less conviction than usual. 3 days after the gathering, Seraphina sent for her in the late afternoon, which was unusual. The Luna's gown preparation was an evening routine, and the afternoon was typically Zarelia's time to handle the household correspondence and the mending. She arrived at the private chambers to find Seraphina already dressed for a private dinner. 2 visiting Alpha Lords were expected, with the emerald gown she had requested hanging on the dressing form. "Finish the lacing," Seraphina said, standing at the window with her back to the room. Zarelia moved to the gown and began the careful work of the back lacing, a delicate set of silk ties that required even tension at each point, or the line of the bodice went crooked. She had done this dozens of times. She knew the exact sequence. She had completed the 3rd tie when she heard the sound. A soft tearing. The particular sigh of expensive fabric giving way under deliberate pressure. She went still. Seraphina turned from the window. Her expression was already arranged, the particular look of controlled fury that had been worn into a groove by long practice. She looked at the torn seam along the left side of the bodice, and then she looked at Zarelia, and her eyes were doing a thing they did occasionally that was worse than cold. They were calculating. "Do you have any idea," she said, her voice perfectly even, "what you have done?" Zarelia kept her face empty. She knew what had happened. She knew what she had not done. But she also knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had been in this room through many versions of this dynamic, that the truth of what had happened was entirely beside the point. "The seam was weak, my lady. It should have been reinforced before." "You are telling me," Seraphina said, taking 2 steps forward, "or that this is a matter of the seam." "I am saying I did not." "Be quiet." She was. The punishment was more careless than usual. That was what frightened Zarelia most about it. Not the pain. She had mapped her own thresholds of pain with the grim precision of someone who had needed to know where they were. Not the humiliation. Not the anger. The carelessness. Seraphina's hands, usually so deliberate in everything they did, were unsteady. The strikes came without the controlled efficiency of someone managing a situation. They came from something rattled, something that had been cracked by 2 days of watching Draven's attention move around the room at the gathering, by Callista Frostfang's beautiful laugh near the fireplace, by the early return from a summit he should have stayed at for 3 more days. On the 4th strike, Zarelia caught Seraphina's wrist. She did not plan it. Her hand simply moved because the 4th strike had landed somewhere that triggered an instinct older than her careful training. Pure physical self-preservation, one arm catching the arm that was hurting her. 1 second of reversal, 1 second of absolute stillness in the chamber. Then Seraphina smiled, and Zarelia understood, cold and certain, that she had walked into something much worse than what had been happening before. Seraphina stepped back. Her own hand moved to her own cheek, 1 quick, practiced motion, and when she let out the cry that brought the guards running, there was a real redness rising on her face that Zarelia had not put there. The guards entered to find Seraphina pressing a hand to her cheek and a look of wounded shock on her face that would have been entirely convincing if Zarelia had not spent 5 years learning to read her from a distance of 12 inches. And the whip in Zarelia's hand, placed there in the half-second of confusion while Zarelia was still processing what was happening, and the torn gown, and the story already writing itself in the air between them. "She attacked me," Seraphina said, her voice breaking in exactly the right place. "I don't know what I've never seen her like this. She simply—" "My lady." One of the guards stepped forward, his face already set with the gravity of a man who had already decided what he was seeing. He looked at Zarelia. "Come with us." Zarelia did not struggle. She had understood the geometry of this moment the instant Seraphina had smiled. Struggling would only make the story better for the person who had written it. She walked with the guards into the corridor, and as she passed the laundry archway, she caught Althea's face. The old woman, standing with a pile of linen in her arms, and her hands pressed over her mouth, and her eyes wide with a grief that was very close to breaking, tears already forming. Zarelia held her gaze for 3 seconds. "Thank you," she said with her eyes, as clearly as she could. "Don't do anything. Stay safe. Survive this." Then the corridor turned, and the dungeon steps appeared ahead of her, cold stone descending into darkness, and she walked down them, because there was nothing else to do. The dark closed around her like something familiar, or she sat with her back against the dungeon wall, and her knees pulled up to her chest, and she did not allow herself to cry, because the guards were still present at the far end of the corridor, and she had always cried quietly, with her face turned away, making herself as small as possible even in her private grief. She had been framed before. Not this formally. This was the most elaborate version Seraphina had attempted, but the architecture of it was not new to her. The planted evidence, the manufactured story, the way the Lunas standing in the castle made every version of events that centered her sound more believable than any version centered on a no-name servant girl. What was new was the feeling in her chest. Her wolf was not pulsing anymore. It was pressing against her sternum with a sustained, a deliberate force that she had no framework for. Not urgency, not panic, but something older. Something that felt almost like a direction. Through the high, narrow dungeon window above her, the evening sky had gone dark. He came back early, she thought, without knowing why the thought came. She had seen his silhouette through the high castle window as the guards had walked her through the great hall, mounted, moving through the outer gates in the fading light. Unmistakable. 2 days before the summit was scheduled to end, she had closed her eyes when she'd seen it. Because it didn't matter. Because it changed nothing. Because he was Seraphina's husband and Ironhold Dravenmoor's king, and there was no version of this story in which his early return helped the girl currently sitting on a dungeon floor. She pulled her knees closer to her chest and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, and told her wolf, for what felt like the 1,000th time in a row, to stop. It did not stop. Draven Nightfang had ridden back from the eastern summit 2 days early, and he had no satisfactory explanation for why. He had told his beta, Ronan Emberclaw, that the negotiations had reached a stable plateau, and that the remaining formalities could be handled by the junior delegates. This was technically true. It was not the reason. The reason was a restlessness he could not name that had been building since the second morning of the summit, turning the comfortable efficiency of his daily routine into something that required more attention than it should have. He was not a man who examined his own restlessness. He had built a career on channeling it, but this had been different, directionless, like a compass spinning without a fixed north. He had ridden hard and arrived at Ironhold Dravenmoor in the early evening, dismounted in the courtyard, and handed off his horse to the stable attendants. And then the scent had hit him. Rain-soaked earth, and something warmer beneath it, like the inside of a warm room on a cold day. Faint, half-buried, almost a ghost of a scent rather than the real thing. Gone before he could locate its source among the ordinary smells of the courtyard. He had stood for a moment with his hand still on his horse's bridle, his wolf going alert with a recognition that bypassed his rational mind entirely. Then he had filed it away and gone inside. It was because he had correspondence to review and a kingdom to attend to, and he did not have language for what had just happened. He was halfway to the war chamber, moving through the upper residential corridor with a folded report in his hand, when he heard the sound. A single, brief intake of breath from the far end of the private corridor, the particular sound a person makes when they have practiced not crying out for long enough that the silence has become automatic. His wolf reacted before he did, going rigid, every instinct suddenly pointing in the direction of the sound like a needle swinging to magnetic north. He took the stairs. He did not knock. He pushed the chamber door open and stepped inside, and the room arranged itself in his vision in the fraction of a second it took his mind to process what he was seeing. Zarelia on the floor, one hand braced against the stone, her arm trembling slightly with the effort of holding herself up, her uniform torn at the shoulder, a fresh cut across her collarbone still bleeding, dark against her skin in the firelight. Seraphina standing above her, composed, already composing. He did not look at his Luna. His feet were moving before his thoughts had assembled into full sentences, 4 strides across the room, and then he was crouching, in front of Zarelia, Alpha King Draven Nightfang, lowering himself to the floor of his own castle before a girl in a servant's uniform. She looked at his boots first, then, slowly, up. "Look at me," he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Careful, as though the wrong tone might break something that was already fragile. She looked at him. Her eyes were amber. He noticed this with a peculiar sharpness, amber like autumn light, amber like the first color of fire. And they were doing something complicated. Not crying, not afraid of him exactly. Something more specific than fear. The particular expression of someone who has spent a very long time expecting nothing, and has just encountered something that doesn't fit that expectation, and doesn't yet know what to do with the discrepancy. "What is your name?" he asked. "Zarelia," she said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness, given everything, hit him somewhere below his ribs. "Zarelia." He said it carefully, as though he was learning the shape of it. "What happened?" "My lady's gown was damaged during preparation. There was a disagreement about how it occurred." She was giving him facts. Only facts. No plea, no performance, no attempt to manage how he received the information. Just the plain, stripped-down truth of a person who had long since accepted that truth rarely produced the outcome you wanted, and who was offering it anyway. His wolf was not stirring anymore. It had risen entirely, sitting just behind his sternum with a snarl that was shaking the walls of his self-control from the inside. "Show me your arms," he said. A breath of hesitation. Then she obeyed. She pushed up her sleeves. He had stood at the edges of war. He had seen injury. He had seen the particular damage that conflict wrote on the bodies of the people who survived it. This was not that. What he saw on Zarelia's arms, and then, as his eyes continued their inventory, on her shoulders through the torn fabric, and on the forearm closest to him, and along the side of her throat, was not the result of a single night or a single incident. It was the accumulated record of years, burns in shapes too deliberate to be accidental, old cuts healed without proper care, leaving marks that would never fully fade. Bruises in stages, old yellow-green ones beneath the newer purpling of whatever had just happened tonight. The oldest scar on her forearm was nearly a decade healed. He looked at it and did a rapid, cold calculation, and when the timeline resolved itself in his mind, he had to lock every muscle in his body from the surface of his skin inward, because what was moving through him in that moment was not something he could afford to let reach the outside. He stood. He turned and looked at Seraphina for the first time since he had entered the room, and she met his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who is prepared for this moment and believes their preparation is sufficient. Her expression was wounded, beautifully wounded, the expression of a woman wronged by a trusted servant, still holding herself together out of pure dignity. She was remarkable at this. He had always known she was capable. He had not known, until this moment, the full scope of what that capability had been directed toward. He did not speak yet. He was not ready. He had learned long ago not to move until he was certain. "Oriana Moonshadow," he said, to the guard in the doorway, his voice perfectly level, "will come to this castle within the hour. She will examine and document every mark on this woman's body. Every one." He turned back to Zarelia, still on the floor, watching him with those amber eyes. "You will not go to the dungeon," he said. "You will be taken to the second-floor guest quarters, and you will stay there until I come to you. Is that understood?" She looked at him for a moment that stretched slightly longer than the question required. "Yes," she said quietly. He turned and walked out of the chamber with the controlled stride of a man carrying something enormous in both hands and refusing to drop it. In the corridor, alone, he stopped. He pressed one hand flat against the stone wall and stood there for a moment, his wolf still roaring in his chest, that scent from the courtyard reaching him again through the corridor's cold air. Rain-soaked earth and warmth, closer now, unmistakable now. His instincts had been running ahead of his understanding since the moment he had walked through the eastern gates. He understood now. He closed his eyes once. Then he pushed off the wall and continued down the corridor, and there was a great deal to untangle before he could follow the thread that had just become clear to him. But he would follow it. He had never once ignored what his instincts told him. He was not going to start tonight. Oriana Moonshadow had served Ironhold Dravenmore for 30 years. She was a small woman, silver-haired, with hands that moved through examinations with a brisk, certain efficiency, and eyes that had seen enough of human capacity for both cruelty and endurance, that very little surprised her anymore. She had treated battle wounds and difficult births and the quiet aftermath of 100 different private catastrophes. She had kept the confidences she was asked to keep and given honest testimony when it was required of her. She had spent 3 decades learning the difference between things she could fix and things she could only document. She entered the guest chamber to find Zarelia sitting on the edge of the window bench, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for outcomes for a long time and has gotten skilled at it. The fresh cut on her collarbone had been cleaned, but not yet properly treated. The sleeve of her uniform was still pushed back from when the king had asked her to show her arms. Oriana looked at what was exposed on those arms for a long moment without speaking. Then she put down her examination bag and said, "I'm going to need you to help me understand the timeline." The examination took an hour. Oriana worked methodically, without rushing, documenting every mark with the careful notation of a woman who understood that what she was building here was a record, and that records needed to be exact. She asked questions in the tone of someone gathering information rather than building a case, and Zarelia answered them the way she had answered the king, with plain facts, in sequence, without embellishment. She had been in private service for 4 years and 7 months. The marks began in the first month. The burn on her inner wrist was from 3 days ago. The scar on her forearm was from a different time. Yes, from the beginning. Oriana's hands paused over her notation book at certain points. Her face did not change, but something around her eyes did. A particular settling of expression, like a person accepting the weight of something they have no power to undo. When she finished and closed the book, she sat in the plain chair across from Zarelia and looked at her directly. "You are the bravest creature I have ever treated," she said. Zarelia turned her face toward the window. The tears came quietly, the way they always did, without sound, with her shoulders held carefully still, with her face arranged in the direction where no one had to see, making herself small even in this. Even now. She had thought she was past crying. She had run out of ordinary tears for ordinary pain years ago. But this was not ordinary pain. This was someone calling her something she had not been called in a very long time. And grief is strange in that way, strange and persistent, finding its way up through the cracks long after you think you have sealed them. Oriana waited. When Zarelia had steadied, Oriana said, "What without sentimentality and without pressure? You don't have to perform anything for me. Not strength, not calm. You can just be in this room for a moment." Zarelia looked at her hands. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you." Later, alone in the guest chamber after Oriana had gone, Zarelia pressed her palm flat against her sternum and felt something she had no words for. It was not hope, exactly. Hope was too bright, too forward-facing. This was more like the first sensation of a limb waking up after numbness. Uncomfortable, uncertain, carrying the possibility of pain as much as relief. Her wolf was not pulsing or pressing or doing any of the small, restless things it had been doing for the past 2 weeks. It was simply present, full and still, and awake in a way she hadn't felt since she was 13 years old, standing in a back field, trying to become something she didn't know how to become yet. She thought about Draven crouching on the chamber floor in front of her, an alpha king, lowering himself to the stone before a servant girl in a torn uniform, the careful quietness of his voice asking her to look at him, as though she were the one who mattered, as though whatever she showed him on her face was the most important information in the room. She had not known what to do with that. She still didn't. She had spent 5 years being treated as furniture, as a problem, as a story someone else was writing. She had spent 5 years calibrating herself to be as small and invisible as possible, because invisibility was the only armor that had never failed her. But the idea of being seen, truly seen, in the way that changes how a room feels, was almost more frightening than any punishment Seraphina had ever invented. Almost. Seraphina sat alone at her vanity. She had dismissed the attendants 2 hours ago, and since then the chamber had been empty and the performance had been unnecessary, and in the absence of an audience, she allowed herself to simply look at her own face in the mirror with the particular honesty of someone taking private inventory. The plan had been simple in its architecture, beautiful in the way that long-maintained systems are beautiful, each element reinforcing the next, every variable accounted for. Keep the girl close where she could be managed. Make the cost of speaking higher than the cost of silence, and ensure that the bond between a mate who had never been claimed and a king who had never been told could not develop roots. For 5 years it had worked, and then one early return, one moment of instinct overriding a king's practiced distance. She had seen Draven's face in the chamber. She was exceptional at reading expressions, and what she had read in his, in the moment he had turned to look at her, was something she had never seen there before. Not anger. She knew his anger. She knew how to manage it. This was more dangerous than anger. This was certainty. She had been expecting the guards for the past hour. She had been expecting a summons, a formal question, some opening move that she could respond to on ground she had prepared. No summons had come. She looked at her own face in the mirror. Still beautiful. Still perfectly arranged. Think, she told herself. And she did what she had always done when the ground shifted. She began, quietly and methodically, to look for the next story. She had survived on stories for a long time. Stories were her truest gift and her most reliable armor. She would survive on this one too. Or so she believed. Ronan Emberclaw was waiting in the war chamber when Draven arrived. He was Draven's beta, broad-shouldered, steady, with the kind of face that kept its own counsel and spoke plainly when it did speak. He had been at Draven's side since they were both 17, and he had served that role with the particular loyalty of someone who understood that being useful to a king sometimes meant telling him things he did not want to hear. He had a folded letter in his hand. Draven read Oriana's report first. He read every page, twice, his face completely still. Then he set the report on the war table and looked out the window at the dark kingdom below. "How long has this been on your mind?" he said finally. It was not quite a question. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There were signs. I kept finding alternate explanations." "Stop finding them." "Yes." Draven turned from the window. "What's in the letter?" Ronan placed it on the table. It came from Cassian Wolfsbane. 3 years ago, from the northern posting. I held it because I thought it was the grief of a man who had been. I thought it was the grief speaking. A pause. I was wrong. You should read it. Draven read it. By the third line, his jaw had set into the expression Ronan had seen only a handful of times in 20 years. Not rage, which moved like weather across his face, but something settled and structural, the expression of a man who has received information that reorganizes everything around it. He reached the final line. He read it. He set the letter down. "Call a council," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Private. Elders. You, Oriana, and Seraphina." Ronan nodded. The scent from the corridor reached Draven through the open window. Faint, certain, rain-soaked earth, and warmth and everything that word certain meant in the language his wolf had been speaking since he had walked through the courtyard gates. He closed the window. There was work before the thread could be followed, but the thread was real, and it was his, and he would not ignore it. The council chamber was a room built for difficult conversations, stone walls, a single long table, morning light coming through narrow windows that did not offer enough warmth to soften what was said in them. Draven had chosen this room deliberately, not the formal throne hall, not the comfortable inner meeting room where alliances were forged over wine. This room. Because what was happening this morning was not an alliance. It was an accounting. Seraphina entered last, which was deliberate on her part. She wore deep burgundy and carried herself with the composed grace of someone who had spent the night rebuilding their certainty from whatever it had been made of. She took her seat at the table and looked at the assembled faces, Ronan, the 2 elders, Oriana, with an expression of dignified patience, as though she were the one who had requested the meeting and was waiting for it to begin. Draven was standing at the window, but he did not turn when she entered. Oriana was called first. She placed her examination book on the table, opened to the documented findings and went through them methodically and without drama. She read measurements and descriptions. She gave her professional assessment of the ages of particular injuries. She noted the patterns, the deliberate symmetry of certain marks, the concentration on areas covered by clothing, the evidence of repeated injury to sites previously injured. One of the elders had gone very still by the second page. The other was watching Seraphina. Seraphina let Oriana finish. Then she said, with exactly the right amount of careful sorrow in her voice, "I grieve that this girl suffered in this way. I had no knowledge of it. She is disturbed. I have said so to several members of the household. She hurts herself during episodes and afterward invents explanations. I have tried to be compassionate, but there are limits to what compassion can self-inflicted injuries," Draven said from the window, his voice quiet and level, "form symmetrical patterns across both arms, both shoulders and the upper back simultaneously over 5 consecutive years?" The room went still. Seraphina's response came a half-breath later than it should have. "Human psychology is—" "Oriana," said Draven. "No," Oriana said, without ceremony. "They cannot." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of a story losing its structural integrity, seam by seam, in real time. Ronan stood. He placed the letter. Cassian's letter, 3 years old, written from a northern posting by a man who hadn't survived to see this moment, in the center of the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. "Cassian Wolfsbane sent this before he died," Ronan said. "He named specific injuries he had witnessed. He named the servant girl who disappeared after he reported his concerns, and he included a final assessment that I, at the time, chose to set aside." He looked at Seraphina. He believed the Luna knew the servant was the Alpha's fated mate. He believed that was why she was kept close, and why the arrangement was designed the way it was. One of the elders made a soft sound. Seraphina's composure did not shatter. It calcified. She drew herself upright, her chin lifting, her expression going from dignified patience to something colder and more architectural. The performance dropped. Not entirely, but enough. She said nothing, which was, as Draven had expected it would be, the loudest thing she had ever said in this room. In the guest chamber on the second floor, Zarelia felt it. She could not have described the mechanism of it. There was no sound, no message, no visible sign, just a wave of something not her own crashing through her chest, fury and certainty, and something raw beneath both, rolling through the mate bond like heat through cold stone. Her wolf surged forward with it. And this time, Zarelia did not push it back. She had been sitting on the window bench with her hands in her lap, or listening to the castle wake around her, telling herself to stay still and stay small and wait for whatever verdict the morning was going to deliver. She had been doing what she always did, managing her hope downward, keeping her expectations near the floor so they could not fall from very high. But the wave came, and her wolf rose with it, and something in Zarelia, something that had been sealed behind a locked door for 10 years, simply opened. The shift arrived the way her mother had once told her it would, in the good days when there had still been good days. Not like a rupture, not like the painful failure of the first attempt at 13, when grief had seized the mechanism and shut it down before it could complete. But this was like breathing after years of forgetting how, the expansion of something that had simply been waiting for permission. Her wolf took shape around her. Silver-grey, quiet-eyed, patient, exactly as patient as she had been through all the years of silence. And it stood in the guest chamber in the clean morning light and simply breathed. Zarelia pressed her face into the silver-grey fur of her own shoulder. She cried the way she had never allowed herself to cry before. Not quietly, not with her face turned away, not with her shoulders held still. She cried fully and completely, and without making herself small, because there was no one here to measure the size of her grief and decide she was taking up too much space with it. She cried until she was empty, and then she sat in the light of the window, human again, trembling slightly, and felt the wolf settle in her chest, not absent, not locked away, but resting like a creature that has finally found safe ground. Draven came to the guest chamber in the late afternoon. The corridor outside the door had been quiet for several minutes before he appeared. She heard his footsteps, recognized their rhythm now, and understood that he had been standing there for a brief moment before he had knocked. He stepped inside at her word. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She was sitting on the window bench in the clean afternoon light, still in the same torn uniform, her amber eyes bright with the aftermath of everything the morning had contained. There was something different about her, and he recognized what it was the moment he saw it. Something in the quality of her posture, the way she held herself. Not the careful, managed stillness of someone suppressing. Something quieter than that. Something that had recently been released rather than contained. The scent that reached him from across the room was no longer faint or half-buried. It was clear and certain, and exactly what he had known it would be since the night before. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with those amber eyes that had been watching everything carefully for years, and for the first time, the careful distance in them had shifted into something less managed, less controlled, still cautious, but no longer armored. "You are not a servant in this castle," he said. His voice was quiet in the way it had been in the chamber the night before, the voice of someone being careful with fragile things. "Not anymore." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "What am I then?" And he looked at her with storm-grey eyes that had spent 5 years glancing past a girl in a servant's uniform, without understanding what his wolf already knew, and he said, "You are exactly who you have always been. The rest of it is something we will untangle." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "I don't know how to be not invisible." "I don't know how to look properly," he said. "Perhaps we're both learning." The afternoon light moved across the window between them. Outside, the kingdom went about the business of the day. Inside this room, something small and careful and real was beginning, not with declarations, not with the dramatic weight of fate bearing down on it, but with 2 people who had been alone inside their own silence, choosing, tentatively, to be less alone. The Seraphina left Ironhold Dravenmoor 2 days after the council. There had been no dramatic public scene. There had been a formal finding by the pack elders, measured, recorded, as precise as Oriana's documentation, and a stripping of the lunar title pending the full tribunal that would follow in the spring. The household staff had been informed by the steward in a brief, factual address. The castle had absorbed the information the way large institutions absorb difficult truths, with a period of shaken silence, followed by the quiet resumption of function. She walked out of her chambers with her chin at exactly the angle she had always maintained, her luggage carried by staff who did not meet her eyes, her expression still performing the dignity of someone who has simply chosen to depart. In the corridor near the eastern staircase, her path crossed Zarelia's. She stopped. Zarelia had not arranged to be there. She had been on her way to the upper terrace for the first genuinely purposeless walk she had taken in 5 years. No task, no errand, no destination chosen by someone else. She had been 3 steps from the staircase when Seraphina had turned the corner. They stood facing each other in the corridor. The guards with Seraphina stopped a measured distance behind. Seraphina looked at Zarelia for a long, unreadable moment, long enough that the silence became deliberate rather than accidental, long enough that Zarelia felt herself resist the old instinct to drop her gaze and reduce herself. She held Seraphina's eyes, and Seraphina said, very softly, not in the voice she used only when there was no one left to perform for, "I knew what you were the moment you walked into proximity with him. I simply refused to let you have it." Not an apology, not remorse, just the truth, offered with the bleak honesty of someone who has stopped needing their own story to be flattering. She walked on. Zarelia watched her go. The straight back, the lifted chin, the perfect arrangement of a woman who had chosen control over everything and had finally found the limit of what that choice could protect. She stood in the corridor for a long time after the footsteps faded. The truth, even an ugly one, was more than she had expected to receive. She found Althea in the laundry room in the mid-afternoon. The old woman was standing at a basin with her back to the door, her shoulders shaking with the small, disoppressed movement of someone crying in the particular way of people who believe they don't have permission to cry loudly. She thought she was alone. She had always been private about her grief, the same way she had always been private about her kindnesses, quietly, without audience. Zarelia crossed the room and sat on the low bench beside the basin. She did not speak. She simply sat. And after a moment, she reached over and took Althea's hand where it rested against the edge of the basin, and she held it. They stayed that way for a long time. Two women who had navigated the same castle for years by different means. One through the armor of invisibility, one through the small, persistent bravery of leaving healing souls in the dark and looking the other way when anyone came to ask questions. Both of them surviving, art in the ways available to them. "I should have done more," Althea said finally, her voice thick. "You kept me alive," Zarelia said. "That was everything. It wasn't enough." "It was." "Althea." She pressed the old woman's hand between both of hers. "You were the first person who looked at me and decided I was worth keeping safe. You have no idea what that meant, what it still means." Althea turned to look at her. Her eyes were red, her face carrying the particular, exhausted tenderness of someone who has been worrying about another person for years and is only now allowing themselves to set the worry down. "You are so much braver than you know," she said. Zarelia looked at the worn stone floor of the laundry room. "I'm learning," she said. 3 nights after Seraphina's departure, Zarelia stood at the castle's eastern gate as the last pale edge of daylight disappeared from the sky. She wore simple clothes borrowed from the laundry, plain trousers, a loose shirt, boots that fit. No uniform, no long sleeves arranged to cover anything. She had looked at herself in a mirror that morning and practiced, very deliberately, not flinching from what she saw. She had been invited to the forest run. Not commanded, not required, not assigned. Invited by Draven, in the corridor outside the library, in the careful voice he used when he was offering something and was not entirely certain of the reception. "The moon is full tonight. The forest is a good place for a first run." A pause. "If you would like company." She had looked at him for a moment. He had waited, without pressure, without expectation, with the quiet patience of a man who had recently learned that patience was worth practicing. "All right," she had said. The shift came easier each time. She was learning this, that the body, once it remembers something fundamental about itself, does not easily forget again. Her wolf rose smoothly in the moonlit clearing, silver-grey coat catching the light between the trees, and she stood for a moment, simply breathing the cold forest air through her wolf's sharper senses. Pine and earth and the distant cold smell of the river. The 1,000 small sounds the night made, now audible in full detail rather than the muffled version the human ear received. She ran. Not from anything. Not toward any destination. Not because someone had commanded it, or because safety required it. She ran because the ground was cold under her paws, and the air was sharp, and her body was whole and capable and her own. And for the first time in a decade, she was experiencing that wholeness without armor over it. She ran because it was simply, purely, the most alive she had felt in 10 years. Draven's black wolf kept pace beside her, large and steady, matching her speed without crowding her, moving alongside rather than ahead. Not guiding, not leading. Simply present in the particular way of someone who understands that running alongside a person is not the same as running for them. They ran for a long time. When they finally slowed at the forest's edge, the sky had shifted from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn, that color that means the sun has committed itself to rising, even if it hasn't arrived yet. Zarelia shifted back, human again, slightly breathless, her hair loose around her shoulders. She stood in the cold air and felt her wolf settle in her chest, full and quiet and resting, the way a creature rests when it has been running free and is now simply content. She looked out at the edge of the trees. Draven came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He had the stillness of a man who had spent much of his life holding himself at a careful remove from the things he wanted, and was now learning, slowly and imperfectly, to stand in a different relationship to that distance. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kingdom spread below them in the pre-dawn blue, towers and walls, and the 1,000 quiet lives that moved within them. A kingdom that would require work in the coming months. A tribunal, a restructuring of the Luna's household, the long, complicated process of what comes after a 5-year lie is finally named. All of that was real. None of it had disappeared. But right now, in this moment, at the forest's edge, with the cold air of early morning moving through the trees, and a dawn still gathering itself in the east, none of it was yet. Zarelia looked at her own hands. She turned them over, looking at the marks that had not healed yet, and the older marks that never entirely would. Then she looked at the forest they had just come from, and at the sky, and at the beginning of the light. She thought about Althea in the laundry room. She thought about Cassian Wolfsbane and the letter he had written from a cold outpost, trying his best to do an honest thing. She thought about Oriana's hands, steady and careful, and her voice saying, "You are the bravest creature I have ever treated." She thought about Seraphina in the corridor, saying the only honest thing she had ever said to her, and walking on. She thought about a backfield and a night sky, and her mother's voice saying the patient ones often run the farthest. She had been patient. She had survived. And she was here. She felt Draven's shoulder brush hers, not accidentally, with the particular quality of a deliberate thing offered carefully. "I don't know how to do any of this," she said. "Any of it." "Neither do I," he said. "We can learn slowly." She turned and looked at him. Storm-grey eyes that had been looking for something they didn't have words for, that had paused 3 seconds in a crowded kitchen 6 years ago without understanding why, and now knew what they were looking for and where it had been all along. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out, slowly, with full knowledge of what the gesture meant, and found his hand where it hung at his side. She did not grip it. She simply placed her hand against his and let her fingers settle and waited to see what he did with the offering. His hand closed around hers. Steady. Without pressure. The way a person holds something they are not planning to let go of, but understands they have no right to hold tightly. The sun began to come up over Ironhold Draven Moor, the gold light spreading over the towers and the forest, and the frost still caught in the grass at the tree line, the kingdom waking into a morning that would bring its own difficult requirements, its own slow work of repair and reckoning, and the long, patient process of building something true on the ground where false things had stood. And at the forest's edge, Zarelia Ashenwolf stood with her wolf, quiet and full and resting in her chest, not silent, not locked away, but at peace, the way a creature is at peace when it finally understands that the danger is past and the ground beneath it is solid. She had survived. She had been seen. And now, in this new morning, she had chosen. The fear that had lived in her chest for a decade, the bracing, automatic, constant fear of what came next, was gone. Not replaced by certainty, because certainty was still a long way off, and she was honest enough to know it, but replaced by something that had no fear in it at all. She was not invisible anymore, and she was not afraid.